want to start with a very prejudiced remark. Why are there no counterfeit $1 bills?
It's not worth the effort to make the $1 bill.
Why are there no counterfeit drachmas nowadays? Right? You only counterfeit things which are valuable, which people desire, and maybe you can get to accept the counterfeit. It's easier, it's cheaper, and you can get all the credit of the original. Okay, now comes the prejudice. As far as I'm aware, there are no counterfeit Reform Jewish institutions. Jewish institutions pretend to be Reform, but the Reform says no, they're not really Reform because they don't live up to our standards and so forth and so on. As far as I'm aware, there are precious few counterfeit conservative Jewish institutions. There are lots of counterfeit Orthodox Jewish institutions. Ones where some will say they're not really Orthodox, they're pretending it, their principles aren't right principles, and so forth and so on. Okay, you can draw whatever conclusions you like. Now, who is really a Jew? Who's really a Jew? I think this is really two different questions. And I want to express the difference by working on one, and then I'll show you how it differs from the other. The Orthodox have a procedure for defining who is really a Jew. Either your mother's Jewish, father's irrelevant, which for a supposedly misogynist religion is a little peculiar, or you convert. And you convert according to the Orthodox definition, which means you pledge allegiance to all of the commandments, you pledge allegiance to all of the Torah as true, and you pledge yourself to live up to it as best you can, like the rest of us. Reconstructionist, conservative, reform, humanist, progressive, egalitarian Judaism all have their own definitions of who is really a Jew. Reform, for example, rebelled against the idea that you should only count mothers. It's unfair to fathers. So they said you're a Jew if you have any parent, either parent is Jewish. And of course, as far as conversion is concerned, there's a gigantic difference between the different groups. The conservative movement used to require circumcision for men, doesn't anymore. Many don't, I should say. They don't have a central body making policy, but many don't. They require a person to pledge allegiance to the commandments that the conservative movement recognizes. They're a subset of the traditional commandments. Reform, of course, does not require pledge allegiance to any commandments. Doesn't require belief in God. Roughly, pay your dues to the local Reform synagogue and sign on the dotted line, put a little J after your name, and you're Jewish. There was a dispute about 25 years ago between conservative and Reform. Conservatives said to Reform, you have robbed conversion of any real meaning. You have no principles, no requirements of belief, no requirements of practice. So it's become a social label. It has no content. Reform said back to conservative, you have broken with the traditional formula, with the Orthodox formula. You've removed from it the items that don't please you, the items that you disagree with, items that violate your principles. You found 85% of the original acceptable to you. We find 2% of the original acceptable to us. Who are you to tell us what we should find acceptable and what we should adopt? Once you've cut yourself loose from the traditional formula, then what you've said is, my preferences, my values, my ideas, my commitments trump the traditional formula. Okay, I follow you. I agree to the same methodology. We just don't happen to have the same preferences, the same principles, the same commitments. Mine trump just as yours trump. Now this disagreement, I think the Reform has the better end of the deal, because there's only one position that can be called in any sense objective. And that's the one that is historically continuous with the origins of Judaism. Short of that, once you've taken it upon yourself to reform, to form again anew, then there are no limits to how the reform should be carried out, and what it should attack, what it shouldn't attack. Depends upon your position that you want to carve out in your Jewish practice. Now, this little snippet of historical background applies in the following way. You have a club. You have a political party. You have a country club, or an internet group, or you have a nation, or you have a religion. Any one of those groups has the authority to determine who is a member and who isn't a member. No one can dictate to a group what its membership condition should be. How the group decides on its member conditions may depend on whether they're a democracy or they aren't a democracy. But each group makes its own membership conditions. There are some countries where if you are born on their soil, you're automatically a citizen. And there are other countries for which that's not true. Can one say to the other, you're making a mistake. You really ought to let everybody who's born on your land mass be a citizen? How could you say that? Each group gets to define its own membership conditions. Now let's imagine someone living, well, I used to say France, but that's just too fantastic. Let's say Spain. Living in Spain, and he's learned English well, and he's studied American history and American politics and American economy, and he is just in love with America, an Americophile. And he believes in American democracy, he believes in American values and American achievements. He's so in love with America that every year he computes what would be his American income tax and sends it as a voluntary contribution to the United States Treasury. And he says, I think I'm an American citizen. I'm more American than most Americans. I know Americans who don't believe in American democracy all the way through. I know Americans who cheat on their taxes. I'm more American than Americans are. That's true, but you aren't a citizen. You can't be a citizen just because you believe the right things, and value the right things, and behave in the right ways. The United States of America has a definition of citizenship. It is within its authority, moral, spiritual, legal authority, and you don't fit those criteria. You never took a naturalization exam in the United States that I pledged allegiance, loyalty, and so on and so on. The fact of your values and your beliefs and your priorities and your practices has nothing to do with being a citizen. Same thing's true with a religion. A religion is another human group, and as a human group, functioning as an integrated human group, not just people living in proximity, has institutions, it has social structure, it has a legal structure, it has the authority to define who shall be a citizen, who shall be a member of the group, and who shall not. The traditional formula goes back to the Talmud, and from the Talmud back to the Torah, and it has been continuous for thousands of years. Now, a group of people arise, and they say, we're not satisfied with that definition. We're not satisfied. We want to operate by a new definition. It's a free world. You can do as you please. But you are clearly creating a new group. Creating a new group with a new membership condition. If you could convince everybody in the old group to go along with you, then you could say it's an evolution of the old group. But if the old group remains continuous and steadfast, and you've now, for your group, decided to create a new membership condition, then it's a new group. I think that the founders of various breakaway Jewish movements understood this. When you call something Reform Judaism, that means it isn't the old style, traditional, historically continuous. You're reforming it. You're forming it anew. As I say, it's a free world. You can do as you please. Reconstructionist Judaism says it in spades. We're reconstructing it the way we want it to go. Conservative, don't be fooled by the title conservative. I didn't know this till I started investigating these matters. I thought, how can you call yourself conservative when you have abandoned so many mitzvos? The word conservative in their title was in contrast to the Reform. We conserve more than the Reform does. They didn't mean to say they were conserving everything. Where you have a pretty bald-faced lie is calling a group Masorati. Masorati means traditional. The Masorah is the tradition. And this is a counterfeit name for what's basically conservative Judaism in England and here. Right? That really borders on a lie. But the rest of them understood this very well. So if you are asking, who is a true Jew in a historically continuous sense, then you've got to accept the traditional, what's otherwise called the Orthodox definition. That's the only one that goes back to the Talmud, and from the Talmud to the prophets, from the prophets to Moses. It's the only one that has historical continuity. The others can be called new Jews, pro-Jews, reformist Jews. You know, the northeast of the United States is called New England. Topographically, very much like England. Imagine the settlers from England had said, we believe in the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is the founding document of the jurisprudence of Great Britain 800 years ago. And we believe that the democracy that we practice is more in line with the original intent of the Magna Carta and more in line with underlying principles of British development and respect and so forth and so on. So we're calling our area in North America England. And those guys over there can think they aren't really England. We're really England. Would anybody believe that? Would anybody listen to that? Excuse me. If you live by the laws in England, then you could be an extension of England. England can expand. It can expand to cover more territory. But if you self-consciously introduce a reform where you're going to live in principles, according to principles different from those in England, you can't call yourself England. When you call yourself New England, that's fine. That's a different thing. Like Reformed Judaism is a different thing. So if you're talking about the legal definition of membership in the group, I think there's only one position that's defensible, and that is the position of the tradition. That's the only one that can claim to be Jewish without any prejudicial input. If you change it because you want to change it, you're making a new group. You want to use the word JAW, it's a free world. You can use what you like. But you've given it a new meaning, you've given it a new identity. Are we together so far? This, I think, is fairly uncontroversial, or should be fairly uncontroversial. But there's another way in which people talk about really being a Jew, living a really Jewish life. Here, I think people have in mind certain beliefs, certain values, certain priorities, certain practices. The person engages in those beliefs and practices and priorities, then that qualifies him for being described as living a really Jewish life. Well, let's see how we're going to do that. Shall we say today, any person who stocks his life with things that Jews have done in history counts as having a really Jewish life? If you look through history, even history of the last couple of hundred years, there have been Jews doing anything and everything you like. Karl Marx was Jewish. Sigmund Freud was Jewish. Isaac Stern was Jewish. If you go back in history, there were Jewish idol worshippers, the First Temple period. There were Jewish Hellenists in the Second Temple period. Shall I take a follower of Aristotle? Aristotelian philosophy, studies it, analyzes it, applies it to his life, believes in its truths of describing the world, and call that a Jewish life? Because many Jews in history followed Aristotle? If that's true, then there's no way of delineating what the content of a Jewish life is, because Jews do everything, like inventing Google and inventing Facebook. Jews are into every different kind of activity. So there'll be no limits. Any kind of life could be called a Jewish life, because any kind of life you lead, there'll be Jews who have lived that kind of life. That can't be right. That, again, I think is fairly obvious. But now, I want to come to a point which isn't obvious at all, and which has very profound implications. Let's take classical Jewish activities: keeping Shabbos, studying Torah, believing in living in the land of Israel, and working to defend Israel against attack, commitment to defending Jews all over the world against attack. Many people would say, well, that certainly qualifies as a Jewish life. A person who engages in those activities, believes in them, commits himself to them, that person really has a Jewish life. Well, let's take a look. Let's talk about keeping Shabbos. Have you heard of Seventh-day Adventists? They are Christians who believe the Shabbos should be on Saturdays, not on Sundays. When Constantine had the Christian elders switch the day of rest from Saturday to Sunday, they thought that was a mistake. And they keep Saturday as their day of rest as an expression of Christianity. Should their Sabbath day on Saturday count as a Jewish element in a life? The first English translation of the Mishnah was made by a Christian cleric living here in Yerushalayim in the 1930s. His name was Danby. When I was becoming religious, that was the only English translation. I used it, and you know what? It was pretty good. And you know what? In his introduction, he says, when I'm translating the Mishnah and I come across a difficult passage, I follow the Tiferes Yisrael. You don't know who the Tiferes Yisrael is. You've never heard of him. It's one of the classical Hebrew commentaries on the Mishnah, and sometimes the commentaries disagree. And he said, I follow the Tiferes Yisrael. Now, he translated the whole Mishnah. Does that count as Torah study? So that we could say that there's a Jewish element in his life, Torah study? A Christian translating the Mishnah because it describes the way of life of people around the time of the founder of Christianity? Believing in the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, supporting it politically, monetarily, there are tens of millions of Bible-thumping, fundamentalist Protestant Christians in the Bible Belt of the United States who believe in the Jewish settlement of the land of Israel, who lobby for it in the American government, and who contribute money. I was here when Teddy Kollek was mayor of Jerusalem, just before the big Aliyah from Russia, and that group presented him with a check for $1 million to help absorb Russian immigrants into Israel, in particular into Jerusalem. Are these fundamentalist Christians, Protestant Christians, living a Jewish life because they're supporting the Jewish presence in the land of Israel? What about supporting Jews all over the world? There are human rights groups, not all of them, some of them are viciously anti-Semitic, but there are human rights groups who do support Jews all over the world on the grounds that they're being persecuted. They're being victimized. They do so as non-Jews, working for justice in the world, and one of their projects is justice for Jews in the world. Does that mean because they're working for justice for Jews in the world that there's a kind of Jewish element in their life, in their practice? I hope it's clear that in all cases the answer to these questions is no. What's the moral? The moral is your life has a Jewish element not based on what you do, but why you do it. The very same thing that we do as a Jewish expression can be done by a non-Jew as a non-Jewish expression. It's not the behavior, but the value behind the behavior, the identity of the behavior, the purpose of the behavior that gives it either a Jewish content or a non-Jewish content. Let me take a very simple example. I mean, I think this, as you can see, how wide-reaching this point is. But let me take a very simple example. I have heard people say one of the gifts of the Jewish people to the world is a weekly day of rest. Okay, if you're lucky enough to live in America, you have 2 weekly days of rest, Saturday and Sunday. Rest, periodic rest. Regular periodic rest. I want you to know, in the ancient world, we were regarded as the laziest of all peoples. 1 day off a week? That was sheer laziness. There was a time when the Roman calendar had 12 months of 30 days. You'll tell me that's 360 and the year has 365 days. There were 5 days that had no calendar dates. 5 days of chaos. Wild disorder. You could do everything you want, any you want, because they had no dates. There were no dates. They were limbo. Then you went back to 30-day calendar, 30-day months. The idea of a day off a week was just completely foreign. Now the whole world has a week and has a day off, or sometimes they have 2 days off. That's the Jewish gift to the world, so they'll tell you. Okay, so now, when an American, or a Brit, or a German, or a South African, or an Indonesian, or a Nigerian takes off his Saturday or Sunday or both, and he reads his New York Times from cover to cover, which takes him 7 hours, and he sleeps in bed till 2 o'clock, and then he goes out for a ride in the motorboat or for a stroll along the river shore and so forth and so on. Does that mean he's keeping Shabbos? Suppose he reads about the Jewish laws of what you can't do on Shabbos and says, wow, that's very impressive. I'll bet if I kept those laws, my blood pressure would go down. I'll bet. And I'll bet if I kept those laws, I'd improve my relationship with my wife because I wouldn't have all the electronic distractions. I'm doing it. I think it's a terrific idea. Is that a Jewish element in his life? That's not what Shabbos is about. Shabbos is not about resting up for the next work week so as to increase your productivity. As one, Stein Grunfeld said, that's the Shabbos of the horse. I live to work. With rest, I can work better. So I rest in order to work better. Shabbos is a day of rest, so I can work better the coming week. That means I live to work. That means you're a horse. A human being works to live. Doesn't live to work. And living is something that work contributes to, but it isn't the goal of life. So, doing it to increase your productivity in the coming week, doing it to lower your blood pressure, improve your relationship with your wife, that's not going to be a Jewish Shabbos. In order for Shabbos to be a Jewish expression, the first thing you need to do, and now I'm going to express the first of many similar commercials, the first thing you need to do is find out what Judaism says about Shabbos. So that when you cease working on Saturdays, you cease working for a Jewish reason. And then it could be a Jewish expression. Before I get to that, maybe, I don't know if the point is clear and obvious or it isn't. Maybe I'll give you a couple of illustrations, just hopefully it will make it clear. I lived through the Vietnam War. Now, that was a rough time in the United States. Some students were sitting down in the middle of the road and stopping traffic or taking over public buildings. The legislatures, town councils, state governments had to deal with this. There was a proposal to stop it with brutal force. Brutal force. Go in with the state troopers and beat them up, let them bleed, break their bones, put them in jail, stab them with brutal force. There were two groups in favor of this strategy. One group was the arch conservatives who said, beat them up, make them bleed, and we'll teach them to give it up. The other group was the arch radicals who said, yeah, beat them up, break their bones, let them bleed, and there'll be a revolution and we'll overthrow the government. So now, the proposal comes up before the town council. Shall we use brutal force as repression? And hands go up. You don't know what he's voting for. Is he voting for preserving the regime? Or is he voting for a revolution to overthrow the regime? You don't know. All you see is hand go up for repression. But you don't know what he's working for. You don't know what his goals are. The meaning of the action lies in the mind and the heart of the agent. It doesn't lie in the motions of his body. So you can have two people carrying out the same motions of body, but the meaning of the action can be very different. When Danby studied the Mishnah, when a Jew studies the Mishnah, they are doing two very different things. One was exploring the history of his own religion, the history of the precursors of his own religion, and the other is studying the Word of God, how he should live his life in order to please the Creator of the universe. Now they're looking at the same pages, looking at the same dictionaries to translate, trying to figure out the logic, but the meaning of the activity is entirely different for the two of them. The same is true with Shabbos. The Shabbos that the Torah describes is the goal of the week. The rest of the week is for the sake of Shabbos, not vice versa. It's not a joke that Shabbos is the end of the week. It's the seventh day of the week. That's very important. The Seventh-day Adventists have something here. When Constantine, the Roman emperor, said to the Christian elders in the 4th century, I'm going to make the whole empire Christian, but you're not getting 2 holy days a week, pick one, and they moved the biblical Sabbath to Sunday, they did extreme violence to the idea of the Sabbath. To this day, by the way, in calendars, in Christian calendars, the first day of the week is Sunday. The biblical Sabbath. Not only is that a corruption of the story in Genesis, where it's obviously the seventh day of the week, does anybody know what the word Shabbos means? The word Shabbos is a Hebrew word with a root that has a meaning. What does it mean, Shabbos?
To rest or stop.
Okay. Oh, you did that very well. Rest, as we normally use it, isn't correct, but you said to rest or stop. Rest can also mean just stop. The ball came to the rest. The ball came to rest 2 inches from the cup. Statement in golf, right? It doesn't mean the ball is recovering its strength, wiping away its sweat, gathering strength for the next round. It just means stop moving. Come to rest can mean to stop. Shabbos in Hebrew means to stop. It means you were doing something and you cease. It's ceasing an activity. In modern Hebrew, the word shvita means strike, a worker strike. Of course, that would have implied that the workers were working beforehand, and that might not be true, but that's what it's supposed to mean. Shvita. So you can't begin by stopping. You can only end by stopping. The first day of the week is the stopping day? That makes absolutely no sense. But it's more than that. It's not just that it comes at the end, and not just stopping, but it means everything else was designed to set up the conditions under which you could stop the setup and enjoy the outcome. Shabbos is the goal of the week. Shabbos is what justifies the week. That's diametrically opposed to the idea that it's enlightened work legislation, where you'll work better in the coming week because you had a day off. So a person who plans for Shabbos, Shabbos is the high point of the week, that person has some Jewish meaning for Shabbos. If he doesn't have that, it's not a Jewish practice at all. And therefore it doesn't qualify his life as having Jewish content at all. Furthermore, there's a large question of what you stop doing. Person says, yeah, 1 day off a week, no work, I can go scuba diving, or I can work on my building my model of the Taj Mahal in my backyard. Well, I have lots of things to do to relax and enjoy myself. That's not the Jewish message at all. The Jewish message is, don't do malacha. What is malacha? Roughly speaking, malacha is an intentional, skillful, physically creative action. Intentional, skillful, physically creative action. That means striking a match will be a malacha. Don't be fooled by a translation of work. Work does not capture this idea at all. When you strike a match, you do it intentionally, you don't do it by accident, and you do it skillfully. If you don't do it skillfully, it's not going to light. And it creates light and heat. Physical transformation. All of them are prohibited. That doesn't mean all effort is prohibited. If you can prove a mathematical theorem in your head, that's fine. According to what malacha, I'm talking deraisa now for the recordings. I'm talking deraisa now. That's not a malacha. Reciting poetry is not a malacha. Walking is not a malacha. It moves you from one place to another, but it doesn't create anything. You can walk around the block the whole of Shabbos. You will not have done a malacha. So what's the message? The message is the physical world is a means. It's not an end. All the transformation of the physical world are finished Friday afternoon, and then you live in that world that you created. But you no longer invest in changing the physical world in any way. Well, that being the case, the message is that your goal in life is not the physical. And that means your physical achievements are only means. And that implies that when you invest in a physical achievement, like building a bigger house or getting a new car or whatever, the question in the front of your mind is, what am I doing this for? What spiritual end does this serve? Shabbos carries that message. That's what makes Shabbos into a Jewish performance, a Jewish activity. Let's take the study of Torah. Study of Torah, as we said, is studying God's will. The Talmud has a very fascinating and challenging remark. Some people suffer. Things happen and they suffer. There are many, many reasons for suffering. One reason that the Talmud mentions is that God wants to increase your reward in the world to come. Called Yisurim Shel Ahava. This is according to Rashi's Pshat. Right? Others disagree, but that's Rashi's Pshat. Want to increase your reward in the world to come. Now the Talmud says, how could you know whether your suffering is in that category? Well, here are two ways to disqualify it. If your suffering makes it impossible for you to learn Torah, it's not in that category. God would not bring you suffering to disturb your learning of Torah in order to increase your reward in the world to come. And if it disturbs your ability to pray, it also is not suffering for the sake of increasing your reward in the world to come. Now, the reader at this point says, I don't get it. Study of Torah, that's central, it's fundamental. We have sources that rank it equal to all the other commandments. I understand that. Suffering that's going to interrupt my ability to study Torah, I agree with you, couldn't serve that purpose. But prayer? According to almost everyone, prayer isn't a biblical requirement at all, regular prayer. Only when you're in danger. If you're not in danger, you want to pray, you can, but you're not required. You ask me for a second candidate, I would say Shabbos. Shabbos celebrates the creation of the world, and it's a weekly holiday, and it carries the greatest penalties for the suffering. It makes it impossible to keep Shabbos. Yeah, I could hear that. That's just too big a distortion, too big a disruption to tolerate. But prayer? Why is prayer so important? The answer is this. Study of Torah and prayer are two halves of a dialogue. In prayer, we are talking to God. And the study of Torah, He's talking to us. It's a dialogue. But the Talmud is saying is, God is committed that there should be a dialogue between God and man. Suffering that interrupts that dialogue isn't suffering just designed to increase your reward in the world to come. It wouldn't be important enough to interrupt that dialogue. So, when a Jew sits down to learn a piece of Torah, one of the things he says to himself is, it's not an accident that I'm sitting here now. It's not an accident that I'm opening this book. It's not an accident that I'm ending up in this page. I have a schedule, and my community has a schedule, and it's divided up in various ways. That isn't an accident. These words that I'm studying right now are important for my soul. God put me in a situation, circumstances where these are the words that are going to impact on me now. This is His communication to me now. Learning it as receiving a divine communication is part of what makes it a Jewish performance. As another thing, people talk about social responsibility. Don't Jews spend a lot of time doing things that have no effect on the world, they don't improve the world in any way? Isn't that wasteful, selfish? All depends upon your perspective. The Gemara at the end of the Dorim says, Im lo brisi yom v'layla chuko shemayim v'aretz lo samti. That's a verse. Were it not for my covenant day and night, the laws of heaven and earth would not be in place. What is this covenant day and night? So there are several options in the Gemara. One option is the study of Torah. Were it not for the study of Torah day and night, the world would cease to exist. The laws of heaven and earth would not function. When I read that Gemara, I said to myself, wow, it sounds to me like every Jew who studies Torah is preserving the existence of the world. That means that a coal miner in Shanghai were he to know the truth, would have to say, thank you to the Jews who are studying Torah, because my existence, my functionality in Shanghai depends upon the fact that you are studying Torah. So I used to present that as a speculation of my own. I have a son living in Lakewood, where Adventists Solomon is the spiritual leader of the Lakewood Yeshiva with its 7,000 students. And he said this in a public lecture. And he reported this to me. So then I said, okay, now I don't have to present it as speculation anymore. I know it's true. I mean, he's an authority. That means one of the ideas that a Jew has in mind when he studies Torah is, I'm maintaining the existence of the whole creation. So it becomes more than just an intellectual gesture, intellectual exploration. That's the second element. The third element is, the study of Torah is supposed to transform the person. When the Torah was given originally, there was a book. Before that, there was a gigantic oral body of information. The book came after the oral body of information. That's a subject which is very important to take account of, just putting it on the table because it's true. And then down through history, you had the book and lots of oral information accompanying one another. Then, little by little, this oral information began to be written down. To the present day, where the vast majority of it is written down, though there's still some that hasn't been written down. The question is raised always, why? Why is it that way? Why wasn't it all written down? Okay, maybe carrying around copies of the Talmud on the camels in the desert would be a little inconvenient, but still, what's the point in having so much of it oral? One of the explanations is this. If it's oral, the only way you can get it is by going to a living teacher. A living teacher is going to be a master rabbi. When you go to study with a master rabbi, he monitors not only your intellectual grasp, but he monitors your spiritual development as well. Someone who treats the study of Torah as an intellectual pursuit isn't getting it. That's not a Jewish expression. If it isn't self-transformative, then it's not what Judaism preaches as the study of Torah. So studying it in order to absorb God's will into my bones, to understand what he wants from me, to develop Jewish sensitivities for making subtle decisions where sensitivity and judgment are required, to do it in such a way as to serve him in the way that he wants to be served, that's part of the Jewish study of Torah. If a person doesn't study it in that spirit, it's not a Jewish expression. Now, this means that there is a great challenge which places like Or Sameach were invented to try to meet. And that is a person who wants to increase his Jewish practice, Jewish identity, his connection to Judaism, Jewish history, wants to increase his ethnic identification, all of which is very praiseworthy. It's not enough to go to a community and observe what they do and imitate them. Because all you're going to imitate is behavior. And that doesn't make what you're doing Jewish at all. You might just as well be doing what a Baptist in the Bible Belt is doing, or what atheistic human rights groups are doing. That doesn't make it Jewish at all. This is a plea for Jewish education. You have to study what the Jewish meaning of that activity is. And when you do that, and you do it for the sake of that meaning, then it can be a Jewish expression. Let's take, for example, charity. What is charity? Well, the normal definition is giving some of my resources to charity. In strict Jewish definition, that's wrong. That's wrong. Because I don't have any resources. Nothing belongs to me. I don't own anything. The world is created by God, created continuously by God. He's the owner of everything. Yes, there are things under my control. Yes, there are things to which I have documents. But you know what that's like? That's like you work for IBM, and you have an office in which you have a computer. It's IBM, it's a supercomputer. Now, you have a private password into that computer. No other worker is allowed to use it. Any other worker who tries to use your computer is going to be fired. It's assigned only for your use. But it's a work tool. It doesn't belong to you. Try taking it home to play 3D games on at home. you're going to be fired. There are certain work tools that are assigned to you exclusively. All of my resources are just work tools. The money in my bank account, I'm like the treasurer of a corporation. Woe to the treasurer who thinks that because he writes the checks, it's his money. He's going to be in trouble. It's the corporation's money. He's just an officer of the corporation assigned to spend the money where the corporation decides it has to go. I don't give my money to charity. God provides me with the resources, a certain percentage of which he says should go to charity, so I turn over that amount of God's money, of which I am the current treasurer, to charity. It's not my money. I never give any of my money to charity. So the whole meaning of the activity changes when you understand that that's the reality behind the universe, that God owns everything that there is. Let's take physical pleasure. What's the Torah's attitude towards physical pleasure? Well, it isn't negative. There are a lot of sources which indicate that physical pleasure is a positive thing. Once a year, I'm going to have to sit her down there, please. Once a year in the spring, when fruit trees are blossoming, we go out to observe them. And we make a blessing. Yeah. Blessed are you, Hashem, God, King of the universe, who has nothing lacking in his world, and he created in it brios tovos, good creatures, v'ilonos tovim, and good trees, lehanos behem b'nei adam, to give pleasure through them to people. He created them to give pleasure to people. So I guess enjoying an apple isn't wrong. If he created them to give us pleasure. There's a blessing that people make, the most ubiquitous blessing after food, one-liner, for everything that isn't special. He creates many souls and their lacks. That's ambiguous. He creates many souls and their lacks, what they lack, and this is the way I'm explaining it now. For everything which you created to enable creatures to live. Two phrases. Created many souls and their lacks, everything you created in order to provide life. So Tosfos in Brachos says that blessing breaks up into two halves. The first, many souls and their lacks, refers to bread and water. Because you can live on bread and water. That's what you lack. That's what you must have. Without that, you're going to die. Everything else, he says, is not the need of a soul. It comes under the second part of the blessing. And all of that, he says, is created l'ta'anug ba'alma, just for pleasure. Kikon tapuchim, like apples, he says. They're created just for pleasure. God created all of them for pleasure. Now we make a blessing on them. And the words we use, the second half of the blessing is, for everything that you created, lahachios behem nefesh kol chai, to give life to the souls of all that live, which means you can't live without pleasure. According to Tosfos, you can't live without pleasure. Pleasure was made in order for you to be able to live. And for Shabbos and holidays, there's something called Oneg Shabbos and Oneg Yom Tov. Oneg means pleasure. Okay, so we have lots of Jewish sources that say that pleasure is important. Why is it important? What good is it? Now you'll have the psychologists tramping in, by the dozens, endorphins in the brain, and all the kinds of mishmash that they believe in. The Jewish point of view is quite different. A person who experiences a pleasure feels gratitude to the one who provided the pleasure. If you know the pleasure came from God, and that's what the blessing is doing, the blessing is acknowledging the pleasure came from God, then the pleasure is going to stimulate gratitude to God, and gratitude to God will strengthen your relationship with God. And that's the goal. The goal of life is to be connected to God, what's called dveikus in Hebrew. So God put pleasure in the world with our capacity to enjoy pleasure, to stimulate gratitude so we'll be connected to Him. So there's a Jewish way of taking pleasure. A person who reads the sources and says, well, I have these many sources in Judaism that say pleasure is important, so now I'm going to do it just the way my psychologist said. That pleasure lowers your blood pressure, and it makes you more accepting of other people, and so forth and so on. And I'm so glad that Jewish tradition is in favor of that. That's not Jewish. Even though the Jewish sources said pleasure is important. But if you're not taking the pleasure for the reason that the tradition said, and with the dynamics, so then it's not a Jewish expression. Now I'm going to mention one. We'll talk about it when I get back. Oh boy, when am I getting back? Getting back. We should have a time for a shir before Purim. But you've probably heard, it's probably leaked through the grapevine to your ears, that Purim is the day in which Jews get drunk. Well, not all Jews get drunk. But okay, there is such a thing as getting drunk on Purim. Now, I've heard a number of people say, well, that just shows how realistic Judaism is. One day a year to get soused, after all. You can't go on the wagon completely, forever. One day a week you get plastered. One day a year, I'm sorry. One day a year you get plastered. And that way, then it shows how realistic Judaism is. That's not Purim. That's not Purim. That's getting plastered. You might as well do that in July 17th. That's not Purim. The drinking on Purim, for those who do it, has a very, very profound Jewish message. And if you assimilate it to the non-Jewish world, it becomes an entirely non-Jewish performance. Just give you one little indication of this. I told you I didn't grow up in a religious household. Maybe you know this from your own experience. I don't imagine the world has changed significantly from my childhood in this respect. A person got drunk at a party, Friday night, whenever it was. Next week, you told everybody about it. You were proud of it. It was considered to be a matter of success. You boasted about the crazy things you did while you were drunk. Getting drunk is a status symbol. It's a status symbol. If you live in a society in which getting drunk is a status symbol, you're going to have a lot of alcoholics. I think there's been a pretty steady estimate in the United States of 15% alcoholics. In Britain, it's much worse. Russia is much, much worse than that. In the Jewish culture, ethos, being drunk is beneath contempt. You wouldn't waste your spit on a person who got drunk. It's just, it's disgusting. It's disgusting. It's degraded. If a person, God forbid, had this uncontrollable desire to drink, he would do it in private and never tell anyone about it. He wouldn't get any points for that. Wouldn't get any social status for that. That's why, one of the reasons why, the problem of alcoholism is so much less in our culture. I wouldn't say it's zero, but those who want us to own up to our failings, who exaggerate it, are also making a mistake. It's much, much less than it is in the secular culture. So, to have one day a year in which you get drunk, which you say, well, yes, Judaism recognizes that it's important to do it from time to time. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's not the meaning of it. The meaning of it is something else, and Hashem before Purim, I'll explain it to you. But here's a good example of where, if you don't have the Jewish meaning in it, then you can be doing what all the other Jews are doing, and it can have no contribution to a Jewish lifestyle. So, the bottom line is, in order to have a Jewish lifestyle, it's not enough to copy behaviors. You have to invest in Jewish scholarship, to read and understand, discuss, analyze, debate what the Jewish meaning is of the things that you do, and then you can have a genuinely Jewish lifestyle.